Okay, are you still doing your long runs when you go easy for a long period of time before getting into marathon pace? A lot of people are, and those runs are wrecking your confidence and trashing your legs for no real gain. If you've ever finished a long run thinking, I'm just not ready for this race, this video is going to change everything. I'm going to show you 3 marathon specific long runs that will actually make you faster, boost your confidence, and get you to the start line feeling sharp and not shattered. These aren't just gimmicks or tricks. This is what works when you're serious about racing your fastest ever marathon. I'm Grantham, a coach and a professional ultra runner who went from running a marathon in 4 hours and 25 minutes to running a marathon in 2 hours and 21 minutes and representing my country for both the marathon and the ultra marathon. And it took me way too long to learn this, but when you step back and realize that there are certain times in the week that really count for you making the improvement, it's how you get the most out of those sessions that you will stop making mistakes like this and start doing it the right way. And if you want to accelerate that growth and progress and start working with a professional who can guide you to running much faster times, then book a call in the description and let's see if we're a coaching match. Runners send me off-the-shelf running plans almost on a daily basis, and a typical long run I'll see is 32 kilometers, so about 20 miles, with 20 kilometers easy, conversational in zone 2, and then the last 12 kilometers at marathon pace. So it's asking the runner to run for 2 hours or more often, and then all of a sudden switch up in gears and run a targeted 10 to 12 kilometers at marathon pace. And so not only have you got this huge shock to the system, which the risk reward is ridiculous, you're also setting yourself up to fail, because usually one of 2 things happens. Either you get to that final 12 kilometers where you've got to hit marathon pace, and the perceived effort is way higher because for 2 hours plus you've been running conversationally in zone 2, and all of a sudden you've got to hit your intended marathon pace, and so you can't hit your splits, and then you go back after to the drawing board and I can't even run for 12 kilometers at marathon pace. How am I expected to do that for 42 kilometers on marathon day? Or you dig way too deep and you hit your marathon pace, your intended marathon pace, and that elongates the recovery because you're running the marathon pace after going too easy for too long and you're shocking the system. Either way, the risk reward, it just isn't worth it. And imagine how that crosses over into pretty much anything else. Would you warm up or go really easy for 2 hours and then play an intense football match? You wouldn't. And so here's the solution. You can try one of these 3 smarter, more effective runs that will not just make you faster, but will help build confidence and simulate race day conditions in a much more efficient way. Long run number 1. This is such a better alternative and for less. So try this. All we're going to do is a 24 kilometer long run. You're going to warm up properly, but within that warm up, we're going to get our effort level and pace to a point that we want to hit in those first kilometers, those first miles that we're running. And we're going to split the 24 kilometer run into 8 kilometers, 8 kilometers, and 8 kilometers. So just like the marathon, or just like the race that you're aiming for, there's going to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the whole run is going to be targeted specifically to the race pace that we're trying to achieve. So in this case, we're going to work with a sub 3 hour marathon. So we're going to work to 4:15 per kilometer or 6:52 per mile. And so for that first 8 kilometers, we're going to run that 20% slower than intended race pace. So if we're working on 4:15 per kilometer, 20% slower, 50 seconds, we're going to run that first 8 kilometers at 5 minutes and 5 seconds per kilometer. And then the middle section, we're going to run at 4:40 per kilometer, just 10% slower. So 20% slower, then 10% slower, and then for the final 8 kilometers, we're running that at marathon pace at 4:15 per kilometer. So what you've got there is the whole 24 kilometers, the whole long run is specific and relative to the way that you're going to be moving over the ground for the entire distance on marathon day. And we're also teaching our body to finish fast, and although the 30 kilometers with 12 kilometers at the end will also do the same, it's too much of a shock to the system there. Whereas with this run, you're starting just 20% slower than marathon pace, then 10%, then marathon pace. And so the whole thing is a nice gradual increase. And that's why it's called a progressive run or a progression run. And don't forget to cool down afterwards. And as soon as you finish the cool down, within that 10 to 15 minute window, get a nice fruit smoothie into your body and start that recovery as soon as you've finished, and get into a habit with that in all of your running, but especially your long run. That's going to take a lot out of you, and your midweek interval session. Long run number 2. All we're going to do is 4 times 5 kilometers at marathon pace. So 20 kilometers specifically at marathon pace, and you're just going to have 1 minute in between walking recovery, or you can have 2-minute jog, whichever you prefer. Really important here is we warm up and we get our body to a point where we're running the effort and the pace that we want to run in that first section. So we're getting towards that 3-hour marathon, that 4:15 or 6:52 pace, before we've even finished the warm-up, which is going to prime our body to be consistent across those 4 reps or those 4 times 5 kilometers. So instead of doing 20 kilometers nice and easy and then trying to hit 12 kilometers at marathon pace and failing because it's a really tough run to do, what we're then going to do is 20 kilometers of volume, nicely split up into 4 times 5 kilometers. It's manageable, and you're on fatigued legs because you've been training. You're then going to freshen up before race day. So we're doing 20 kilometers of volume instead of trying to do 12 kilometers, and we're hitting that. And if that initially looks like you doing 2 times 5 kilometers and then 3 times 5 kilometers and 4 times 5 kilometers, that's brilliant. And what you've also got there, and this is the really important part where you've got to be self-aware, don't just mindlessly follow the training plan. If you get to 2 or 3 times 5 kilometers and you're just not feeling it that day, and you're seeing your heart rate drift up or the pace drift away from you, then just bring it back and think 3 times 5 kilometers, really good session. 4 times 5 kilometers was the session, but I'm just not there today, and therefore this will do for today. If you can get to that point where you're that self-aware, your progress is going to be like this, and there's going to be no back steps when you're getting injured and ill. Long run number 3. Now we're going to do a twist on that first run, and I'm going to work it out so that it's running a 2:20 marathon. So I used to do this session a lot. It's a brilliant session, it's fun to do, and the time passes like that. So I'm working towards 3:20 per kilometer or 5:20 per mile. And I'm going to do 24 kilometers again, split up into 8 kilometers, 8 kilometers, 8 kilometers, again, beginning, middle, and end. And for those first 8 kilometers, I'm going to run that at marathon pace plus 10%. So I'm running it at 3:40 per kilometer. And then the second 8 kilometers or 5 miles, I'm running at marathon pace, so 3:20 per kilometer. And then you're running the last 8 kilometers, or I'm running the last 8 kilometers at threshold. And for me, that would be about 3:10 per kilometer. So 5% faster than marathon pace. What you've then got, and the way that that feels, is you're running a big chunk, very, very, very relative as to the way that you're moving over the ground on race day. And it's a longer run than a typical half marathon. It's a great half marathon session too, but you're also running a section, 8 kilometers, at faster than marathon pace. So again, you've got that element that's going to help you fast finish a negative split. And at the same time, it's making marathon pace feel easier. And if you want to make that session a bit more manageable to begin with so that you can progress onto that, the way that I would do that is make that first 8 kilometers slower than 10% slower than marathon pace. So it wouldn't be 3:40, it might be 4 minutes, 20% slower. And again, you've got to remember that warm up. If you're not ready to run quick in that warm up, all of a sudden that first 8 kilometers is going to be a shock to the system initially, bigger injury risk, you're not going to get as much out of it, your heart rate will drift up throughout the 8 kilometers, and therefore it's going to make the next 8 kilometers more difficult, and it's going to make the final 8 kilometers almost impossible. Whereas if you put a really good warm-up in there, where you're doing something like 2 times 2 minutes at the pace you want to hit that first 8 kilometers, you're gold. And if you're then looking after your body with a cool down and getting a fruit smoothie in afterwards, that consistency and forward progress is just all yours. Remember, when we've got a specific training block. And for me, it's 13 weeks towards the marathon or half marathon, whatever it is you're training for, then usually that includes 10 days of taper. So we've got 11 and a half weeks to play with, which is typically 22 to 23 sessions. So that's 12 long runs. And therefore it's so important to get those long runs right and to minimize the injury risk, but also make them as specific as possible to the marathon so that you're going to move yourself forward towards that PB, towards that intended race pace. Often runners are working hard enough. They're working so hard and they're often overworking. When in actual fact, again, step back and look, where do I need to distribute my energy and focus into the week? And how can I be doing more and getting more out of each of the big sessions? If you think you're putting loads of effort in and you're not getting the returns that you feel you deserve, then click the link in the description and get the professional guidance of somebody who's not only been there, but also helps people to get there.